Okay. So this month, for our theological lecture, we're taking a dive into something a little bit deeper. A couple months ago, we gathered to discuss Luther's theology on two kinds of righteousness. And last month was history of Lutheranism and how it spread from Germany to the Nordic countries to the United States. And today we're going to look at a topic that's commonly referred to as the theology of the cross. I'm going to call this a theological understanding of suffering. So we'll take a peek we'll start with Luther, and he'll sort of be our foundation and our conversation partner. So for those of us that are in the Lutheran Church, Luther is, of course, not the final say or authority on everything, but he is a good place for us to start and engage in conversation with him and go from there. So we'll start with Luther. We'll get a little bit of more modern theology in the mix as well before we take a peek at some history and some modern social events, historical and social events that inform how we do theology, and then we'll circle it back to Luther as our conversation companion to get a bigger understanding of how we can make sense of our relationship to the world and the suffering that goes on both individually and collectively. So what we're going to do with Luther today is look at a document that's called the Heidelberg Disputation, just a few years, over 500 years old. If you were present with us for last month's lecture, and we did a short introduction to Luther's timeline and his biography, but just to review that for a second, in 1517 is sort of the most famous date with Luther. October 31st of 1517, he posted the 95 Theses, which then were printed and published and spread throughout Germany and made its way to Rome. And they were sort of his grievances of the church, and his intent behind posting those was to engage in an academic debate in order to assess where the church was and the things that in his mind needed to be changed. A year later, he was sent to Heidelberg, a town in Germany, as a part of a convention and a gathering for the Augustinian order, which was the order to which he belonged. And he was asked by his spiritual father from the order, Johann Staupitz, to put together some debate points, some more theses in a way to elaborate more on the theology that he has been writing. And that he did. It wasn't too controversial. He didn't write about indulgences or the other goings on in the church. He was trying to find theological common ground between his new emerging Reformation theology and the theology of the church. So several different topics are touched in there, but we're going to look at just 3 theses points. And the first 2 we're going to look at now help us define in Luther's mind what theology is and who a theologian is. So he says, and these 2 are read together, the one who beholds what is invisible of God through the perception of what is made is not rightly called a theologian, but rather the one who perceives what is visible of God, God's backside, by beholding sufferings and the cross. So to flesh this out and make it a little more understandable, essentially what he's saying here is that a theologian only speaks of what they know based on their experience. So that's what he's referring to as the visible things of God. If somebody starts talking about the things that are beyond human perception, the mystical, the things that are a part of this life that that's impossible for us to have certainty in, then we leave the realm of theology and go into, I guess, what one could call speculation. And theology is not about speculation. Theology is about making sense of the world around us and the experiences that we have. So for Luther, a theologian has the responsibility to only speak about their own experiences and how they help that person make sense of the world and the goings on. So this is going to stick with us today as everything we talk about is going to come back to this one criteria. Can we make a certain assertion because it speaks to our experience? And if not, then it's not a part of our work as theologians. And I'm going to use the word theologian inclusively to say that we are all called to the work to create theology. So when I say theologians, I'll use that inclusively as we as theologians, being you and me. So we'll come back to this a little bit as well, and we'll flesh out a little more what Luther means by beholding sufferings and the cross, as that is we're gonna hone in on that as our topic today of our understanding of suffering and our experience of such. Now, moving forward about 450 years from Luther, so a slightly more modern development of theology is what's known as process theology. And I'm not equating Luther and what we'll define here in just a moment as process theology, because they come from different traditions and different contexts. However, I think there's some work here where we can begin to piece these two things together. So let's get this working definition out. So this definition comes to us from Stanford. They're using the phrase here, process theism, which comes to us from two philosophers, Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Hartshorne. And they are working within process theology, which for them means an essential attribute of God to be fully involved in and affected by temporal processes. In other words, whatever happens in this world as time moves forward and events happen, God is deeply involved in those things, and those things actually impact and affect God. This idea, that is process theology, contrasts neatly with traditional forms of theism that hold God to be, or at least conceived as being, in all respects non-temporal, read eternal, unchanging, read immutable, and unaffected by the world, read impassible. So those three descriptors, eternal, immutable, and impassible, are words that most of us are probably used to hearing when we talk about God. Even if we don't use those words, the images that come to mind of God as being, as some of the philosophers refer to God as the unmoved mover, the one who at the beginning of time set the whole world into motion and then steps back and either just watches the whole world play out, or somehow manipulates and is sort of the puppeteer of all the things that are going on. In either case, what happens in the world does not affect God in this more classical theology understanding, that God is somehow removed from time in another realm, that God's character does not change over time, and God does not have an emotional investment in the world. Process theology says that God is too impersonal for our understanding of God within the Christian context. So process theology says God is temporal. God is deeply involved in the movement of time within this world. God is changing because what goes on, just as it affects us, affects God. The reason for that is if we go back to Genesis, and we read, God says, "Let us make humankind in our image," that we and all forms of creation bear the image and are made in the likeness of God. So, speaking about experience, we can then make certain assertions or assumptions based on our own behaviors and our own observances of the world around us. If we are this way and are then therefore created in the image of God, then perhaps there's something about our nature that can help us more deeply understand God. So as we become more and more ourselves, as we build up experiences and time moves on, then it's quite probable that God functions in the same way. So this is a little bit of a more modern and a different understanding of process theology. So what I'd like us to do moving forward, and we'll piece this together, but I want us to hold these two things: process theology as God moving and changing with time, and Luther's understanding of a theologian being somebody who speaks only from their experiences and speaks only to that which they know. So those are going to inform us as we continue to move forward. So it's really difficult to engage in the work of theology for any period of time without coming across what's known as Theodicy, which is the understanding and the study of suffering. So the ultimate Theodicy question is, if there is a God, why is there suffering? Or where is God in the midst of suffering? So I'm posing the question, how do we make sense of suffering and evil? And I want to pull this cartoon partially seriously and partially comically, just to sort of exaggerate here. But if we're looking at, if you remember these three adjectives here, eternal, immutable, and impassible, that's the philosophy driven that drives traditional theology. Some of that begins to break apart the moment we look at suffering and the complexity within the world. So just as a way to get us to ponder a little bit more, if God exists, he is omnipotent and can stop all evil. He is omniscient and knows how to do it, and he is morally perfect and desires to end evil. But evil does exist, so either God doesn't exist or God is not all three of these. Again, this is about half serious, half just sort of lighthearted ponderings here. I think the reality that we'll begin to engage is much more complex than what this little 3-panel cartoon is showing us. But this does point to the reason that this question of theodicy is continually asked every generation throughout every movement of theology within the church, that this question comes up. We have a theological system that says God is all-powerful and controls all of this, but God is also righteous and just. However, there is evil. So where does this fall apart? And when we start to recognize that something in this logic doesn't quite settle with us theologically, one of two things can happen. And we find culturally and collectively people move in one direction or the other. And so we're going to put these two dichotomies together. We can either move in the direction of what's known as absolutism or move in the direction of relativism. Absolutism is I would say, theological conservatism. This idea that if we're recognizing the omnipotent and omniscient power of God and suffering, then absolutism says, well, that suffering is there for a reason. And God is obviously behind that suffering, and either we just wash our hands of it and say we can't understand it, but it's there, or we try to make sense of it. Absolutism also says that God is in control of everything, and that God is also the source of a universal morality or a universal ethical code. So the 10 Commandments, for example, come as divinely inspired texts from God and are 10 rules that ought to apply across cultures, across time and space. They're an absolute universal rule. That's an understanding of absolutism. On the other hand of the spectrum is relativism, the idea that this idea breaks apart, so therefore there isn't a God that controls all of this, or there is a God, but God isn't involved and has nothing to do with the suffering, and that there is not a universal moral code, that the 10 Commandments were revealed in a very specific culture at a specific time, and they're not as meaningful for us today, or they're not as meaningful for people that are a part of other cultures. So it's all relative, it's all contextual. The relativism is just one step away from what's also known as annihilism, which is the idea that nothing has any meaning. Everything is so ambiguous and free-floating and free-forming that it's meaningless. We're just all floating around, and there's no point behind any of this. So these are the two extreme responses that we can have when we find that this structure or this understanding between God and suffering begins to break down. We can move, and we do. This happens. We move further into absolutism. There is a God behind all this, and relativism. There is not a God, or at least not a God that is involved or has any bearing in this. The problem with this is that most of us don't actually fall on one side or the other. There are people that do, and there are groups and religious traditions and atheist organizations on all ends of the spectrum that fall on one point or the other, but the vast majority of humanity finds themselves floating back and forth between one end and the other. So it becomes much more complicated than that. So I could pick thousands of different examples of suffering in human history, but I just want to highlight 3 different points of tragedy, despair, and human suffering from the last 70 years of human history, and just take a look at how relativism and absolutism has played out in these 3 events. We'll start with the Holocaust in World War II. This was a pivotal point in not only global history, but more specifically, a pivotal point in religious life in most of Western Europe. Following the Holocaust and in post-World War II Europe, the question was posed, if there was a God, how could God allow something like the Holocaust to happen? And so what Europe began to see was a breakdown of the theological structures and a movement into a post-Christendom, a secular world. The church and religion became far less important. It still exists in a cultural sense in many parts of Europe, but the majority of folks do not identify as being a member of a church, and this sort of decrease in religious life and theological understanding stems directly from the aftermath of World War II. So that was the response of much of Europe during that time, was to move into relativism. If there was a God, how could this have happened? This did happen, therefore, either there is no God, or it is not a God that I want to be associated with. I think we see more drastically a movement in both directions with September 11th, 2001, with the attack of the Twin Towers in New York. This was also a pivotal point theologically. We often talk about socially and politically within the United States, but this was a very big turning point theologically in the religious life of Americans. And people in this country particularly moved equally in both directions. So on an absolutist side, when we encounter that deep amount of suffering and pain and evil, as what happened on September 11th, you get a absolutist theological response such as perhaps we as Americans did something to deserve this. It was a quite common theological response from many churches, many fundamentalist and conservative churches, to say that somehow God's punishment upon an increasingly liberal country somehow deserved this. Another response to that, and still within the realm of absolutism, is we saw that in the form of Islamophobia and an American society that became deeply afraid of anything that was associated with Islam, Muslim practices, or the Islamic State. And those things were labeled as being from the Antichrist. They were not Christian, and they were enemies of America and therefore enemies of God. That was a very deeply rooted theological assertion that is located strongly on the absolutist side. how relativism became introduced in the theological realm of American society was as a negative response to the theological conservatism. Many Americans saw the conservative church's theological response to the events of 9/11, and said, if that's what the church says, maybe we don't want to be associated with this anymore. And we saw a deep movement both towards and away from what's known as Christian nationalism, the idea that God has a preference for Americans above all other countries. We might not be as aware of it now as we were 20 years ago, but that theology is still very strong in many American churches. Somehow there's a connection between being an American and being a Christian. Another phrase for that is civil religion. So somehow the suffering through events like the Holocaust or 9/11 are either deserved, they're a form of punishment, or like the people that were on the receiving end of the suffering did something to deserve it, or it's a part of God's master plan. These are forms of absolutism that can inform the way, whether negatively or not, the way that we talk about suffering. The current pandemic that we're in of COVID-19, I don't think we know yet what the full aftermath of this experience is going to be. But we have already begun to see a little bit how this plays out, both on a relativism side and absolutism. On the side of relativism, think about how people outside of the church have responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. Science, which has been a wonderful advancement for us and has in record time given us multiple vaccines to be able to use and a way to more deeply understand the virus. By many people, science is used as a way to push out any theological understanding, as if science and theology can't coexist. That's one manifestation of relativism. On the other end of the spectrum, somehow COVID is, again, another divine punishment from God. When this first started in another congregation, I was in a Bible study and somebody said, you know, God could stop the virus if he wanted to. This was before shelter in place, but the virus was already rampant in the US. God could stop the virus if he wanted to, but there's a lesson to be learned here, and God won't end the pandemic until we've all learned the lesson. I don't know what lesson that was or is, but that was the theology behind the statement. Somehow God was the puppeteer behind this pandemic, causing it all to happen. When we were in the deepest parts of shelter in place, there was a lot of political debate around churches and whether churches should be forced to close their doors physically. And people gathered in churches and said things like, I won't catch COVID because God will protect me. These are all theological statements that somehow address what we think about suffering and the realities around us. So again, like I said, I don't think we quite know what the long-term theological effects of COVID are going to be, but we do already see movements in both of these directions. The issue with absolutism and relativism is that they both make assertions that cannot really be proven, and assertions that actually get in the way of our ability to recognize mystery. So one theologian who writes quite a bit on process theology by the name of Catherine Keller wrote in a book called On the Mystery, the claim of absolute truth is the single greatest obstruction to theological honesty. And when we look at the phrase absolute truth and try to understand what that means, absolute truth is not only found in the absolutism side of the spectrum. Think about an extreme form of relativism is a dogmatic atheism that says absolutely there is no such thing as divine or sacred. Both of those a dogmatic atheism and a deeply fundamentalist understanding of God as controlling and causing this suffering as a way to teach us a lesson. Both of those, I would argue, are absolute truths or statements that come with absolute certainty that it, as Keller says, is an obstruction to do honest theological work. If we go back to Luther, both of those assertions there are speaking of something that cannot be deeply connected to our experience. They look at the reality around us and they automatically jump to a conclusion that goes beyond human wisdom. So I'm going to just put up a few quotes here to help move us into another direction, just to get us to then say, okay, well, what does all this mean? Keller also says theology is process, which she proposes as an alternative theology to absolutism and relativism. Theology as process remains, like every living, breathing organism, open-ended. So if you remember, like I said, most of us don't live on one end of the spectrum or the other. We're floating around in the middle. And depending on where we are in our lives, we're in different places. So it's not a static thing. It moves around quite a bit. Theology then, process theology, is open-ended, dwells in the mystery, experiences life to its fullest, without the need to justify or to make sense of something. A theology and process looks like an interdependence of relationship. So if we think back to the classical theology of God as omnipotent and immutable, what we would see instead of the graphic that you see now, we would see two circles that do not intersect. There is God and there is the world, and God is removed from the world and has no bearing or relationship to it. But a process theology talks about this phrase, shared power, that there is an interdependence, that God is infused in the world just as the world is infused in God, in some way that there's a sharing of being here. And this goes back to that phrase that I said at the beginning, what happens in the world deeply affects both God and us. So we can talk about that as shared power or interdependence, but I think this graphic gets the point home that there is an intersection. So what does that have to do with suffering and a life that includes suffering? So we return to Luther, who in his next point, thesis number 21, says, the theologian of glory calls the bad good and the good bad. The theologian of the cross says what a thing is. So if we think about what he's referring to as a theologian of glory, is a theologian who fit into point number 19, which is a theologian who speaks of things that lie outside of their experience. And that's also is a theologian who justifies suffering in the world and tries to declare it as being a part of God's plan. So if we look back at the Holocaust, for example, just because it's such a stark example, a theologian of glory calls a bad thing good. Suffering is never a good thing. It is one of the aspects of life that is deeply painful, whether it's human-caused suffering, like the Holocaust, or a natural disaster. But regardless, suffering is never a good thing. And a theologian of glory makes a bad thing good by saying then that there's some plan. God is behind it, and there's some plan. It's a part of, maybe it's a blessing in disguise, or it's justified by saying the people that suffered deserved it. This is what Luther says. Of course, that's a very strong example, but this is what Luther says by being a theologian of glory calls a bad thing good. And then a good thing becomes bad. The good thing about God meeting us in suffering and grace being extended to every single human being is offensive to a theologian of glory. So that's called bad. Meanwhile, justified, or what we often call redemptive suffering, which is bad, becomes good. Whereas a theologian of the cross calls a thing what it is. A theologian of the cross is honest about the world around them. What Luther means here by a theologian of the cross is not just the wooden intersection of two planks, on which Jesus, a historical figure of over 2,000 years ago, was nailed and executed. Of course, Luther, in other writings, that's what he means. But here, when he says a theologian of the cross is somebody who creates theology from the perspective of human suffering. So the cross is something that happens every single day. It's the experience of human suffering in the world. And an honest, a true theologian talks about it from their perspective in a genuine way. So I tried to think of different statements or things. Some of these are platitudes that people say, or some of them are statements that, as we've alluded to a little bit already, are said to justify or make sense of suffering, to scapegoat, to place the blame on someone else, to say that it's deserved. I would say that these statements, even though they're shrouded in God language, are not actually theological statements because they don't meet the criteria that Luther's putting forward. They are statements of glory. They are statements that call bad things good by justifying suffering, or they make assumptions that are outside of the realm of human wisdom, meaning they don't speak from our true everyday lived experience. They make assumptions that we can't possibly know. So some of these, like I said, are platitudes. They're well-intended. They try to make suffering more bearable, but they don't usually help, and they're certainly not theological. So one example is when somebody passes away, we might often hear, God needed another angel in heaven. People often say those things, or God needed another alto in the choir. It's meant to sort of make somebody feel better. I've never been a part of a conversation where it's actually made the person they're talking to, feel better. So it never really does what it's intended to do. But that's not a statement that can be known for certain. And the theological ramification of that is, well, then does God not care about the emotions of the people left around? Is it more important to have an extra alto in the choir than it is to care about the daughter or the mother or the spouse that's left behind by the death of that person? Again, a platitude, but what's the theology behind it? Another one, God has a plan. There's a master plan behind all this. Another one, similar to that could be like, it's a blessing in disguise. These, again, don't have any malicious intent behind them. However, they don't deal with suffering honestly. And they can't, while we can make those statements hopefully or wishfully, we cannot make those statements theologically. Because there's no way that God's plan, if that plan exists, it can be a part of our human understanding. It is outside of our realm of wisdom. And therefore, as an honest theologian, cannot make that statement. Then we get statements that justify human suffering by either saying that it's a part of a plan or that it's deserved. So 9/11, for example, is God's punishment for America becoming too liberal. There was a Baptist congregation out of Kansas that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 said that it was God's punishment for the United States becoming too accepting of homosexuality. That church is still in existence and still preaches these sorts of things. So suffering is somehow a lesson or a punishment from God. We hear statements, the Holocaust is a hoax, the Holocaust was deserved. Both statements that try to either explain away the suffering or to say, again, it's a part of something that humanity deserves. Suffering as a test or a punishment. God gave your mother cancer because it was her time to go. This is also kind of related to the master plan idea. But again, where does this honor the experience and the emotions of the people that are around, or even the person that goes through terminal illness or something as painful and awful as cancer? So not only what does that say about us that are making the statements and us that are left here after the person dies, but what does it say about the God that is supposedly in control of all this? God doesn't give you more than you can handle is another one that explains away the suffering. Oh, it's not really that bad. Everything happens for a reason. It's a blessing in disguise. It's just not meant to be. Some of these are very deeply related. And then actually what people say a lot, which is a misunderstanding of the way karma gets used in Eastern traditions, but just to say what comes around goes around. You get what you deserve. People often talk about karma, even though that's a sort of an appropriation of karma from Eastern traditions. It's not the genuine understanding of what karma means in traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism, but we do use it in the West as sort of a you get what you deserve kind of thing. So again, these are just a few. People say lots of things. Some of them are, again, most of them don't have any malicious intent. We're just trying to make ourselves and others feel better or to make sense of the world around us. But we have to think about, are these helpful in the way we talk about suffering? To say that there's a master plan behind all this. How can we know that for sure? And are we being theologically honest with ourselves and others? So how can Luther's understanding of being a theologian of the cross make sense for us? So to help kind of summarize and bring us to the sort of climax of this, I want to bring in another conversation partner of the German theologian Vitor Westhella. And I'll read these sort of back to back. They're from the same work, a work that deals specifically with Luther's understanding of the theology of the cross. I'm trying to see if that title is going to come to my mind. I believe he calls it Usus Crucis, the use and abuse of the cross and the practice of resurrection. So he says, theology is done from the point of view or perspective of the cross as a disposition instead of being about the cross, which would be the objective sense of the genitive. So the point of what he's trying to say here is that Luther actually doesn't use the phrase theology of the cross. He says there is no such thing as a theology of suffering. It's impossible to create a theology of suffering, a systematic idea, a systematic way of interpreting events and what they mean and how we're in relationship to it. Luther says that doesn't exist, and it's an abuse of theology. So that if there's not a theology of the cross, there is only somebody who does theology from the perspective of the cross, meaning from the perspective of human suffering. So rather than a theology of the cross, one is a theologian of the cross. There is no system to understand, but there is only the lens through which we can view the world and make theology from that perspective, which might not seem like an important distinction, but the more you spend time with this, the more important that distinction actually becomes, because there is a huge difference between theology of the cross and a theologian of the cross, because it ultimately says more when we say theologian rather than theology. We're making a statement about how we interact with suffering. We cannot create a system to understand this, because that's not our role as people to understand suffering, but it is our role to be present in suffering and to be present to ourselves in the midst of our own suffering and be present to others. So he continues, the theologian of the cross, from the standpoint of the cross itself, cannot speak about the cross. She can only speak from the cross in sheer faith without evidence, in complete trust amidst abandonment, and her radical refusal to say that evil is good. Her radical refusal to say that evil is good. This location calls us to simply be honest about the world and not buffer the cries that come from the crosses, even today. So this is why, again, it's important to say we are theologians of the cross and not creators of a theology. Creators of a theology spend too much time speaking about abstract things rather than actually being in the midst of true human experience and creating meaning from that. So really, to boil this down, I think to the most basic understanding, which I think is such a beautiful thing to say that Westphal does, is that this location calls us to simply be honest about the world. That's what a theologian does, and that's what a theologian of the cross does. Doesn't look at a big moment of human suffering in history and tries to make sense of it, which in the long run does more harm than good, by saying perhaps that was deserved, God's trying to teach us something, or this happened because X, Y, and Z. That's not helpful. But what is helpful from a theological perspective is what he says, to not buffer the cries that come from the crosses today, meaning don't explain away the suffering of other people, but be present with them, because that's where God is. If it's one thing we learn from the cross, it's that the cross and the crucifixion is not a punishment. It's not God placing somebody on the cross as a scapegoat for the sins of all these millions of people that are going to be born thousands of years later. That's such an abstract theological idea that comes to us much later in the Christian tradition. But what the meaning of the cross is from this Lutheran perspective is that is God on the cross, that is God in the midst of human suffering. And God's judgment upon the world and suffering is Jesus's words of, forgive them, for they know not what they do. There is no explanation of this suffering is caused by X, Y, or Z, or this is deserved, or this is what's going to happen, but there is simply a presence in the suffering that allows people to be with each other and to move forward. Because moving forward can only happen when that deep relationship is there. So a theologian of the cross is in deep relationship with themselves, with others, with the world around them. And that's why process theology is so important, because it emphasizes that God isn't the one causing the suffering, and God isn't far away observing the suffering, but God's relationship is actually strengthened through the world because we allow ourselves to be present in suffering, and that's where love can spring forth. So I hope that, by putting some of these bigger points from today on the same screen can help us hold them together and see how all these things come together. So to think about where we've been and what we've discussed, a theologian, from Luther's perspective, which I think is helpful, only speaks from their experience, which means that certain statements like it's a part of God's plan, or perhaps it was deserved, or it's a blessing in disguise, while they might be platitudes, are not theological statements, because we can't know those. We can't make those assertions based on our experience. So a theologian that speaks from their experience is present to that suffering, rather than, as Westphal says, buffer the cries that come from the crosses. All of creation, including the creator, God, God's self, is in process of becoming more fully itself. We live somewhere between relativism and absolutism. So we live in the mystery that lies in the middle. There is suffering, and we experience it, and we're together. What happens in the world deeply affects both us and God. It's that shared power, that deep relationship, interabidingness. We all share one body together. That is the body, our body with God, God's body. When I say body, I mean like the larger cosmic nature. All of us are mutually connected. We view the world from the cross, that is the perspective from which we see everything that happens, that we understand the world, we try to be honest about the world and the way it actually is, and we allow the sufferings, we allow ourselves to be present to each other in the suffering, and allow that to be a place that nurtures love and relationship. And the cross like I said, is a place of suffering, but it is the place where God and humanity meet. That is what Luther means by the cross. A theologian does theology from the perspective of suffering and the cross. The cross is the meeting place. It's the intersection of the divine and the human. It is the most profound place. And as Vestila says, the crosses of today, anywhere where there is suffering is the cross, is the place where God meets us. So we can ask ourselves, where are the crosses today? Where is the suffering around me? Where's my own suffering, the suffering of other people? And rather than trying to explain it away or put it into a bigger master plan of the universe, how is that an invitation? Can it be an invitation for us to be present to each other? So we're left at the end then, where is God in suffering? That's the ultimate Theodicy question. And for me, I'm reminded of the story in the Gospels of where the angel Gabriel appears to Mary and tells her that she's pregnant and that she'll give birth to a child. His name shall be Jesus. And the Hebrew name for him is Emmanuel, which translated into English means God with us. Where is God in suffering? If we are to take our theology honestly and seriously and to speak from only our experience, then what we can say is in suffering, we are present to each other just as God is present to us. And we, as theologians, need to do the work ourselves to be okay with that answer and to say, this I can truly say, but nothing else. I'm going to stop the recording here.